Right, welcome back to you. My name is Nicole Kente. I'm standing in for Tony Ndoro this evening. You've just heard from our UK guest, Luke Upton, on his list of the 20 hardest men of rugby. He's gone and written a book there for us. But for some, the price has been too heavy to pay. A group of rugby players in the UK are now suing World Rugby and the RFU for negligence on concussion and overall safety in rugby. The man who has done extensive research on this issue is Professor of Sport and Exercise Medicine, Professor Jon Patricios. He joins us now live via Zoom. Of course, still in studio, we do have Liam Dalcom with us. Now, Prof, thank you so much for making the time to chat with us this evening. Now, I read up on these guys in the UK, and I see the basis of the claim is that sport governing bodies failed to provide sufficient protection caused by risks of concussions. Of course, this is your field. Give us, for our viewers, explain to us what exactly these risks are.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, I think as your previous guest stated, rugby's a very physical game. That's part of the attraction of the game. It's not a contact sport, it's a collision sport. And in those collisions, there are significant forces involved, and some of those forces are transmitted to the brain. And therein lies the risk of injury to the brain. And concussion, which is really the basis of this claim, repeated concussions, is a very interesting injury because it's an injury that you can't see. There's no visible wound. And so it presents as a series of functional changes. So the player presents differently in various ways, either with physical symptoms or difficulty in concentrating, difficulty in thinking, sleeping, emotional changes, etc. So the basis of this claim is that repeated impacts to the brain in these particular players has resulted in long-term effects. And this has now resulted in some of them having symptoms of dementia, early onset dementia in their 40s, and their claim is that the Rugby Union, World Rugby are responsible for this because they weren't taken care of at the time. But interestingly enough, another point made by your previous guest was that the game has changed significantly. And over the 15 or 20 years since these players were at their peak, there's certainly been significant interventions by World Rugby internationally to help educate us all on the dangers of concussion and put in place a number of steps to help prevent the long-term consequences of these injuries.
Now, Prof, just quickly, before I bring Liam in here, I'm quite interested to know what exactly are the safety rules and regulations, and are we meeting them, even dating back to some of these players who played 20 years ago, whatever the safety rules and regulations were at that time, were we meeting them? I mean, for them, of course, to now be suing.
Well, what's interesting, 20 years ago, and I first started treating professional rugby players in 1995, at that stage, even our definition of concussion was very different. You either had to lose consciousness or lose memory to be diagnosed as concussed. Those were the only two criteria. We now have a list of over 20 symptoms that we look for. So the net has been cast far wider, and we have a lower threshold for diagnosing concussion. So what happened then and what happens now is very, very different. In terms of what's been put in place in the modern era is firstly an extensive education program for players. So over 500,000 players have been educated internationally, according to World Rugby's protocols. And the medical staff also have to undergo compulsory education programs before they're allowed to manage professional rugby players. And then that has found its way down to youth level and schoolboy rugby as well. And then we can talk about some of the rule changes as well. So certainly, for instance, the tackle situation has been significantly better marshaled in the modern era. And there are harsh penalties now for tackles which may cause head and neck injuries. So I think the scenario has changed, which doesn't, of course, detract from the severity of the claims of these players. And we need to show significant empathy in terms of their medical condition. And what's critical is that as clinicians and scientists, we really institute research programs which find out exactly what's going on in the brain, not only in those severe concussions, but in what we call those subconcussive episodes, where they're not overt symptoms, but the impact may still be significant enough to cause some long-term brain damage.
Liam, I know you've got a question for the Prof.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Prof about schoolboy injuries in particular. I think SA Rugby, some of the statistics they have put out suggest that between 12 and 15% of schoolboys get concussed every year.
Yeah.
Does that sort of tally with what you've got as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say it's at least that level, and probably if we look at the statistics, they're going up. Not just because the actual incidence is going up, but because we're now recognizing concussions which we didn't acknowledge occurring years before because of our expanded definition. So it's actually a good thing that we're looking out for these, that we're tallying them up, and we're understanding that this is a significant injury in terms of rugby union, and it's something that at all levels of the game, we need to institute protocols that will make a meaningful difference to these players, not only now, but as the group of players in Britain is imploring us to do in their futures as well.
And I suppose the million-dollar question is, I mean, there have been lots of interventions. Rugby is, let's say, cleaned up the act. And with these interventions, obviously, people ask questions about whether the game is still the same. Do you foresee 5, 10 years down the line that rugby as we know it will be fundamentally different?
I think that's a moot point, because if we look at the area where most injury occurs, it's in the tackle situation. And that doesn't just apply to head and neck injuries, it applies to all other injuries as well. And that is a fundamental part of rugby union. So if you're going to significantly impact injury statistics, you're going to have to take the tackle out of the game. And that's going to fundamentally change the game. And we're not going to recognize it as rugby union as we know it. So if we're going to keep the game as it is, as a contact and collision sport, we're going to have to be able to manage as much of the situation around the tackle as possible to be able to make it safer. And we're going to have to put medical protocols in place that make sure that players with potentially serious injuries are taken out of the game until they have recovered. And there is recent research, which shows that if you have a concussion that is properly managed, and you go back when the time is right, then your risk of re-injury is significantly decreased. If you go back too soon, your risk of repeat concussions is higher, but interestingly enough, your risk of other injuries is also higher because of the effects on the brain and the coordination that goes with that. So yes, it's a multifaceted approach, but tinkering with the laws can be done to a certain extent without changing the fabric of the game.
Prof, I'm quite interested to know, how do we infiltrate this at school level, with Liam just touching on the schoolboys? I remember when I was in school, my cousin played rugby as well, and I watched him be tackled, and he was in the air, and before I knew it, he hit the ground and he was out. I've seen players as well have a dislocated arm, and they just pop it back and you're back in the game. And when you're in high school, you literally are given a few sporting codes to choose from. You choose that and you start playing. So I don't think the seriousness of what you're mentioning now has deeply infiltrated into school level. How do we combat that? Because that's ideally where it starts. Passion for a sport for any kid comes at that level.
Yeah, that's quite true. I think that there's an incredible passion involved in schoolboy rugby, and anyone who's been on a Saturday morning at a schoolboy derby will recognize and appreciate that. And it's one of the beauties of the sport, and it's not something that we want to take away. But we do need to infiltrate every person involved in schoolboy rugby, from the players themselves through to their parents, coaches, heads of schools, etc., to understand that if you risk players' health at this stage, it could have long-term sequelae. Now, in South Africa, we have a world-class program that is run by South African Rugby called BoxSmart. And BoxSmart is a compulsory medical intervention program for all rugby coaches and referees in the country. It doesn't matter whether you are coaching the Springboks or refereeing at international level, or you're blowing an under-10 B game on a Saturday morning. If you're going to be involved in rugby as a referee or a coach, every 2 years you have to undergo the BoxSmart program. And that is heavily slanted towards head and neck injury prevention and intervention. And so I think we know that that's had a significant impact in terms of injuries in South African schoolboy and club level. And if we look at neck injuries in particular, 12, 15 years ago, we had an absolutely catastrophic rate of severe neck injuries in this country. And that has come down significantly because of the intervention of the BoxSmart program.
Professor
Now,
Patricios,
concussion is slightly more difficult to measure because of the nature of the injury and because we're more aware of it now. As I said, our statistics have actually gone up recently. But in a way, that's a good thing because it shows awareness and we are making progress at schoolboy level.
Professor Patricios, I'm so sorry to cut you off. We have unfortunately run out of time, but thank you so much for that insightful conversation. It really is one that needed to be had. Now, still to come on Sunday Sport, Tiger Woods learned the game of golf from his father. Now he's imparting that knowledge to his own son, Charlie. That's coming up. Stay with us.